Okay, well, welcome to the Big Brown Gadfly. It's been a while since the Big Brown Gadfly has come on, and much to issues in the Southern Baptist Convention. I had a tortured history with that organization, and there was a part of me that wanted to let go of everything that had to do with Southern Baptists. Unfortunately, I can't quite let go of it yet because the Southern Baptist Convention is now in the news again regarding the issue of sex abuse. There was a sex abuse task force which came out with a report that was 388 pages long, and there's a lot to talk about with it. Today, I am going to be joined by a guest that may surprise some people who are familiar with the Southern Baptist Convention because he is not part of my camp. He's not someone who is tied to many of the people that I'm tied with, and he's had conflict with people who are my friends, and I've had conflict with people who are his friends. But he came forward with an article this week about corruption and cover-up at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, which in many ways vindicated me indirectly because his work, his undercover work, proved that what I experienced at Southwestern was a pattern and it was entrenched. So I want to welcome him to the program. It is David Baumgartner, who currently lives in New Orleans, Louisiana. Good evening. How are you doing, David?
Hey, Bobby, thanks for having me.
All right. Okay. Well, David, it is really quite momentous to have you on here. We have both been on very intense journeys, but
Yeah,
once upon a time, we actually shared the same space, and the space was a classroom. Isn't that true?
that is exactly right. So, for those of you who don't know, Bobby, or Dr. Lopez, as he was known to me back
Right.
then, was my Latin teacher, and I must say that I enjoyed taking Latin with him
Okay.
much more than with his replacement after he was fired. But that's a
Right.
story for another time.
Yes, yes. There are many things I could talk about what happened when I left Southwestern. But if you will, after we get off the air, I will have you conjugate laudo in the subjunctive future tense. No, just joking. All right. So, so David Baumgartner is an interesting character. Most people know me as a conservative. That might be an oversimplification, but I certainly publish in conservative places. I hang out with conservative people. I supported Donald Trump. That is not the story for David Baumgartner. He was known for his opposition to Donald Trump. He actually lost a job at a Baptist church because of the fact that he was so vocal about Donald Trump. And he came to the defense of people at the church who were being persecuted because they did not support Donald Trump. So that was interesting. David and I actually share very similar views on race and racial justice, which is interesting. That was one of the parts of my story that got lost when I was at Southwestern. A lot of my conflict with the Greenway administration at that time was because I was actively involved in trying to expand multicultural programming. I was doing missions to Latin America. I wanted to expand that. I wanted to expand the course offerings in multicultural arts and humanities. And I also wanted to develop that drama club. I started a multicultural drama club, and all of that met with a lot of disapproval from people around me. So David is known as a liberal. We're not that far apart on race. You know, maybe we don't agree on Trump. And David has also been known because he really jumped into the fray and felt critical of a lot of figures like Paige Patterson, right? And the members of the Conservative Baptist Network. So it is shocking to a lot of people that then he comes out with an article this Monday really exposing the problems at Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary, and not the Southwestern Baptist Theological Seminary of Paige Patterson. That's an old hat. We've all heard the criticisms about that, but he was talking about the problems under Greenway, under the supposedly more progressive administration. So I want to start by talking about that. I'm going to ask the first question to David. I want you to be able to talk about the article that you wrote and what the content of it was. I've put a link to that in the descriptions on YouTube and Facebook. But let me start with this. David, many people will be surprised that you have come out critical on the Greenway administration. There are many people who consider his administration progressive on race and on sex abuse. Those are issues that matter to you. So let me just start by saying that's the reputation that Greenway has. The reputation that Greenway has is he's the anti-Patterson. He's the guy who's good on race, good on sex abuse. Does your experience under Greenway hold up to that reputation?
No, not at all. And as a matter of fact, I would say that any insinuation that Adam Greenway or those in his administration would be progressive in any meaningful sense on issues of racial justice and issues of sexual abuse is laughable. I will say this, though, Bobby, I do think that Adam Greenway and those in his camp have liked to brand themselves that way, especially as Greenway came in on the coattails of Paige Patterson's firing for mishandling sexual abuse, both at Southwestern and at Southeastern back in the day. So, no, I do not believe that Adam Greenway cares about the abused as much as he brands himself and says that he does. That's not to say that I think Adam Greenway is inherently evil and has a deep-seated malice and hatred for survivors of abuse, but it is to say that I believe Adam Greenway is a hypocrite. And the reason I believe he is a hypocrite is because when I confronted him over allegations of misdoings and the mishandling of sexual abuse at Southwestern, I was essentially threatened. I wasn't explicitly threatened. I was not given an "if you do this, then I will do this" kind of statement. But it was more of an insinuation of, well, David, we know that there are things in your student file that you're not proud about, and it'd really be a real shame if something were to happen. So no, I do not think that Adam Greenway cares about sexual abuse as he has branded himself, nor do I believe that Adam Greenway is sensitive to issues of racial justice. I don't want to mention his name, but in the meeting I described in the article, I'm not going to mention his name just because I consider him a dear, dear friend, and I don't want to bring him into this controversy, but there was a prominent friend of mine who was an African American that I had a wonderful relationship with. And Adam Greenway basically said, I'll tell you what I told this guy. You need to watch what you say, kind of thing. So it was very funny to me that publicly Adam Greenway would say that he cared about racial justice, racial diversity, released a statement when George Floyd was murdered. But behind the scenes, Adam Greenway was bad-mouthing minorities in the Southern Baptist Convention, and this maybe could be a discussion for another time, fired all of the minority faculty members and replaced them with old white men from Louisville, Kentucky.
They did. That was one of the things that was only reported about in Inside Higher Ed and, ironically, Capstone Report. Those were the only publications that discussed, I published something in American Greatness that alluded to it. But certainly when he fired all the minorities and replaced them with white men, the conservatives didn't want to touch that issue because they don't like anybody talking about racial justice at all. Janet Mefford was a radio host who at one time was a friend of mine who actively called people. And I'm just saying this because I received word from 4 different people that she had conversations basically bad-mouthing me and telling people not to cover my story, not to help me. And she did this when she knew that I used to be her friend and that I had been fired in early December of 2019, and I had no other job lined up. I was the only working income in my household. I lost my health insurance. I lost my ability to support my family. It was a terrifying period. But that is the length that Janet Mefford went to. And she did that largely, if what people told me is true, she said that she told them to cut me off because I was playing the race card. So what Adam Greenway did with the racial situation, he did that knowing that the Janet Meffords of the world were going to stifle that because they just inherently don't want to ever be on the side of anyone pointing out racial discrimination because that makes them liberal. Okay. And he knew that the
Right.
people in the Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, because I emailed back and forth with Karen Swallow Prior about what was going on, but those people were not going to talk about the racial discrimination at Southwestern for the very simple reason that they had invested so much in Greenway as the replacement for Patterson. And so they were protecting all of the interests that were there. So it was a terrible situation. The racial situation was terrible. I do have a copy of an email that I've never made public from one of the African-American students who wrote to Greenway, and she was so profoundly hurt that the play that we were doing on African-American history, it was a play that basically we wrote and we produced together. We had to do it off-site in a coffee shop. It was about Mary Todd Lincoln's best friend, and the Greenway administration basically made it impossible for us to do anything. They would shut us out of the theater for practice. They wouldn't let me use the listserv to make announcements about the play. So it was a terrible time for race. But let's talk about the sex abuse, because this is even worse. Now, is it fair for me to describe you as a survivor of same-sex abuse? Is that?
Yes, that would be accurate.
Yeah. So both of us share that. And so one of the things that this is how I view it, and I don't know whether you have the same perception, but one of the things that I feel is that when you survive sex abuse, you do often have ways of coping. You have ways of responding to the trauma that sometimes, if people don't understand sex abuse, they can take it as character flaws on your part. Sometimes you're needy. You're quick to jump into one camp of people because you had an experience of not being protected. So you want to be protected. So you cling sometimes to people. Sometimes you're distrustful. You push other people away. You're awkward. You don't know who to trust. Sometimes you can be paranoid. Those are all things that sex abuse survivors sometimes encounter and experience. And so when you're thrust into an environment like what Southwestern was, where people are talking about sex abuse all the time, but they're totally ill-equipped to deal with sex abuse survivors, because I think lost in the discussion, in my mind, was any discussion of how the church could actually interact with sex abuse survivors who have those mannerisms, those tics, those maladaptations, those types of responses that sometimes they create conflict, they create tension, they strain relationships with people. But the church does not have any plan of how to incorporate people who have survived sex abuse into their community. Instead, it's all been vengeance, vengeance, vengeance. Let's go find people and punish them. And I think we do have to hold people accountable. I'm not saying that we don't, but I think that was a huge part of it that was missing. So I guess let me just give you the floor a little bit to talk about that. And I'll start with this question. Why do you think sex abuse has become the focal point now? Is it that we just needed something sensational in order to get everyone's attention because people have felt that there is so much wrong with the convention, there's so much corruption, there's so much intimidation, there's so much nepotism? Is sex abuse merely the sensational issue that can hold people's attention? Or, why is it the focal point? Let me just give you the chance to talk about that.
Yeah, no, that's a wonderful and insightful question. Bobby, I think part of the reason that this issue has become the focal point in recent years is that firstly, there's just been more exposure to the existence and persistence of clergy sexual abuse. In part, we have a very public and controversial report by the Houston Chronicle dating back to 2019. But even prior to the Houston Chronicle covering clergy sexual abuse in the convention, years earlier, other advocates and whistleblowers had been running websites and running their own databases and tracking ministers who had abused others but were being shuffled around from different autonomous Southern Baptist churches to other churches. So you have the issue of exposure. But you also have, in a certain sense, a kind of weaponizing of sympathy. And here's what I mean by that. Insofar as sexual abuse is a grievous sin before God, it's vile, it should be punished to the utmost extent of the law. Those with certain political aspirations in the Southern Baptist Convention have used the abuse issue for their own political ends. And that has happened on both sides. I want to make that explicitly clear. That has happened by people that were
Yes.
formerly, I guess what you would say would be in my camp, or I guess a better way to put it would be that I was formerly in their camp, though it was never really accepted and taken in. And then on the other side, you have the group that just wants to shut survivors up and think that the problem will go away if people just stop talking about it. And really and truly, neither camp has offered any meaningful solution, any meaningful reform initiative to address the issue.
Yeah. Amen. 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 Thank you. Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, I think that you bring up a great point. I absolutely believe that both sides, let's just, if we can kind of zoom out of the Southern Baptist Convention, just look at the national landscape, think of how much sexual harassment and sex abuse was weaponized by the Republicans going against Bill Clinton in the late 1990s. And so when in 2002, when the story about the abuse in the Catholic Church broke, yes, all of a sudden liberals had their weapon to beat conservatives up with. So both sides have weaponized it. And what you said that I think is so important is I just have not seen any kind of proposal from either side about how to deal with the survivors, because and how to prevent it. I don't even prevention, I don't think, is a big part of it. It's almost, the system almost encourages more abuse to happen, because there is so much advantage to be gained by finding a boogeyman, by vilifying a perpetrator. Because look what happened at Southwestern. The fact that Paige Patterson mishandled some sex abuse cases, that allegation allowed an entire group of people to come in to fire a majority of the faculty and the administration. I believe it was a majority, and to completely remake the institution and not do anything to help sex abuse survivors. In fact, they fired me, and then they called you in the office, and they did what is the worst possible thing to do to a sex abuse survivor, is to make this vague insinuation that they know things about you that they're going to embarrass and humiliate you with if you stand up to them. Because that's something isn't that fairly familiar for sex abuse survivors, that especially same-sex sex abuse survivors. They always come with the accusation that you're gay, which, hey, I've seen that on the internet already in recent weeks about you. They're already pulling that, oh, he's gay, which is a way of basically saying, well, he wasn't, really abused, or that it's not an issue. He's just, trying to hide what is in him, which kind of reinforces the mythology from the gay community that people are born that way. It's crazy that the way that all of that has worked out. Now, when you look at what happened with Greenway, tell me a little bit about what you perceive as the tactics used by his administration that seem to be part of a larger pattern within the Southern Baptist Convention. What are the tactics that we have to be prepared for and that we have to expose and deal with when we're talking about the way that sex abuse survivors have had to navigate this convention?
Yeah, certainly. So those who were kind of cognizant and aware of kind of terminology and discussion that happens more broadly in the survivor community, they'll be familiar with terms like, gaslighting, DARVO, that kind of thing. I'll tell you, though, one thing in particular that was a distinctive of Southwestern, and this is kind of a distinctive of Southern Baptist, and I was even guilty of it back in the day, but this really kind of thin veneer and kind of veiled thread of, well, brother, bless your heart, we love you, we're praying for you. I mean, back in the day, leaders of the conservative resurgence, if a colleague or a pastor did something that they didn't like, they would arrange to send flowers to their doorstep. I heard a story actually just a couple of weeks ago that at Southeastern back in the day, the former president of Southeastern would send neckties in the mail to those who had pissed him off or done something that he thought that they should not do. So it really is. And this happened to me multiple times. I had multiple private conversations with Southwestern administrators where it was, well, brother, please come to us. There's no need to make this kind of thing public. We want to settle it, and we care, and we have these policies and procedures in place. And they would guilt you they would guilt you into giving them the benefit of the doubt. And sometimes they would use scripture to do it. And then eventually something would happen, something would be found out. You pick up your phone, you send an email, you get a meeting, and it's just this perpetual and vicious cycle. The week after I graduated with my bachelor's degree from Texas
Right.
Baptist College at Southwestern, I had a 45-minute conversation with Southwestern's Vice President for Institutional Administration, Colby Adams, the former Chief of Staff to the President. And, you know, I had already had a couple of conversations with him about these kinds of things. I'm not at liberty to divulge what spurred on my phone call to him. But, you know, he assured me everything was all right, that Southwestern took the abuse issue seriously. Bobby, a week later, the Guidepost report comes out, and it's revealed that a vice president at Southwestern said that he believed survivors wanted to see the world burn. And I note this in my article. Adam Greenway and Colby Adams and Edward Upton, who made those remarks, have not at all addressed or apologized for Edward Upton's remark to Ronnie Floyd in an email that survivors want to see the world burn. So as far as I'm concerned, if Southwestern is not willing to repudiate that sentiment, that must be their stance. And I believe that Southwestern's actions have made it abundantly clear that that is their stance, that survivors want to see the world burn. So I tweeted a number of weeks ago that some people do in fact want to see the world burn, but what Edward Upton, Adam Greenway, and Colby Adams have failed to consider is that they are the ones holding the book of matches.
Right. No, you know, that is very much the way that I felt they reacted to me. I mean, because I submitted 3 resolutions to the Southern Baptist Convention. I'm just laying this out there so I can say I'm not someone who sat on my butt complaining and never did anything. Okay, I really went out there, and I tried to address it as much as I could. So the thing that was open to me was to be able to send resolutions to the Southern Baptist Convention for its annual meetings. In 2018, I submitted one basically saying, we've got to stand up against this movement to ban conversion therapy. And the reason why I found that very important was because I saw, having come out of the gay community, I grew up in the gay community, my mother was gay, you know, having seen all that, I know that a lot of what happens is that all of this mythology that comes from the gay community, that you're born gay and you can't change, and if you try to change, you're going to kill yourself. This gets in the way of being able to help people who have survived same-sex abuse, because it is a natural part of the response to being abused in a same-sex context to question your sexuality. And of course, there are always going to be predators who will be happy to feed that insecurity, because they'll tell you, you weren't abused, you wanted it, you asked for it, this is who you are, look at the way you talk, look at the way you walk, you're just like the way I was. So, you know, that was my experience, so it's got to be your experience too. So conversion therapy is very important in a church context, because when you're dealing with people who came out of same-sex abuse, they have to be able to talk about it with the understanding that their goal is to overcome their abuse, which means they want to overcome that doubt about who they are, and they want to return to the way that God made them. Okay. That resolution was knocked down. It never even made it to the floor in 2018. At that time, it was being drowned out by all of the other chatter about Patterson getting fired and Mike Pence coming to speak. I don't know if you remember this in 2018. That was when J.D. Greear got elected.
I was there, and I voted for J.D. Greear.
Yeah. Well, I mean, so that came about, that happened, and then they had all this stuff about sex abuse, but they still were not acknowledging the same-sex abuse side of it. So it was like they were missing a third of the issue. You know, they just weren't dealing with a big part of the issue. And I was called.
And Bobby, if I could interject, I just want to go on the record for our viewers and let them know that you and I, even have a disagreement over some of the things that were in that resolution. I didn't agree with the resolution in its entirety, but I am agreed with you in the power of God and in the power of the gospel to change people. But but I am of one mind with you, though, that the issue was not addressed. So we may disagree on that, but we are agreed that the issue was not addressed.
Well, the issue was not addressed, and then I was called into Jeff Bingham's office after that, and he said, there's a gentleman's agreement, and you can't say things that cast doubt or appear critical of entity head. Couldn't publicly disagree with Albert Mohler or with Russell Moore, who both of them had come out against reparative therapy. and were defending the idea of sexual orientation. So, that happened, and I was already down that road of being called in for meetings and things that I was doing to exercise my free speech as a citizen and as a Baptist was then being factored into whether I was going to be able to support my family at a job at a Southern Baptist institution. So that was a mess. And then the next year, I did a resolution that was more specifically about sex abuse, and it was denouncing non-disclosure agreements and retaliation, all of the things that the Guidepost report ultimately did denounce. In the report, they talked about that. And after that came out, then I was called in by Randy Stinson, who was at that point the provost. And he basically said, the people on the resolutions committee are not happy about the fact that you put that in. The Ethics and Religious Liberty Commission, then led by Russell Moore, were not happy that you put that in. And so after that, I had a string of meetings where it was Colby Adams was again involved. They kept on saying, well, you need to get our permission to publish whatever you're going to publish, whether it's under a pseudonym, whether it's on Facebook, whether it is in a private email, whatever it is, I had to get permission to talk about anything. And eventually I was fired on that. And then finally I did a third resolution just on the corruption in general, which basically that third resolution is almost dovetailing with the report from from the Sex Abuse Task Force, and so I've seen how when you try to bring the discussion up and when you try to move things forward, you're stuck. You're stuck because you're going to find all of the doors closed around you. And I think that the underlying tactic in the Southern Baptist Convention from all sides is to make you feel personal anxiety for your status, to make you feel uneasy and nervous so that you won't talk. And that's toxic for an abuse survivor. That's a toxic situation.
No, I think you're exactly right, Bobby. Right. And I was in full agreement with you on the NDA issue. And maybe that's something we can circle back to. But there certainly is with respect to your third resolution, there certainly is a culture of fear and intimidation that prevents people and stops people from coming forward. And so I think this is why people tend to get very, very upset whenever you finally free yourself from the clutches of what really is a tentacular institution, because once you do that, you can no longer be intimidated or threatened with any kind of punitive action for speaking up about what you know. I mean, what prompted the meeting with Colby Adams and Adam Greenway in June of 2021, just a couple of weeks after the annual meeting in Nashville last year, was that I saw a peer, I don't want to use their name, but there was a peer who made a very, very lengthy Facebook post about some abuses that they had undergone. And I went to the administration with those concerns, and I said, is any of this true? And Adam Greenway looked me in the eye and he said, well, if I knew what you knew, I would feel the way you feel. But because I know what I know, I feel the way I feel. I mean, so just the gaslighting, the innuendo, and the fact that there is a culture of silence and intimidation in these institutions whenever people come forward with concerns about institutional responses to abuse.
Right. No, it seems that these are the tactics. It's almost as though they've been trained and coached in them, because a lot of the same people who had the same proteges, the same mentors, they all seem to have these tactics of the gaslighting and also of the phone call to the people. They call your church. I remember in one of the meetings, they said, well, maybe you should ask your wife, which I thought, that's such a veiled threat. And in another meeting, I remember the dean, Mike Wilkinson, saying 3 of your colleagues feel very uncomfortable and they won't tell you who. These are just manipulative, underhanded tactics that I think are used across the Southern Baptist Convention. They're very effective because you can't fight back at them, and they tend to threaten you with social isolation. So I think that's really hard. Now, I do kind of want to ask you about your conflicts with Tom Buck. We'll just keep this brief because I don't want this to become a complete. I don't want to go off on a rail. That's one area where I didn't agree with you in terms of I wouldn't have published the article that you published about Tom Buck. But I did think that Janet Mefford's response to you was completely out of line and uncalled for. And just to be fair, I want to let you know that I did contact Janet Mefford and I said, I'd like you to go on the record, and she never responded back. But I was going to ask her about this history of her attacks and how they're often underhanded. And they're not right. I didn't think it was fair that people started to speculate about your sexual orientation. So I thought that was unfair. But if you could do it all again, would you publish that essay about Tom Buck?
Yes, I would, Bobby. The
Okay.
one thing I would do differently is that I would have reached out to the Bucks for comment. And just so you know, I had a conversation with Tom earlier this week. We spoke probably
Right.
for about an hour and a half, and he conceded a couple of things. He told me, well, he said everything you wrote was perfectly in bounds. It was a matter of public record. He said, but you didn't contact us. And so I apologized. And I said, you know what, Tom, you're right. I should have reached out to you. I said, I didn't neglect to reach out of any malice or anything of that sort. But you're right. I should have reached out to you for comment. And had I reached out to you for comment, then, certainly then the angle of the story would have been a little bit different. Although I will say, in my defense and to my credit, I was the first person to report that someone was out to get the Bucks. So that's something that a lot of people don't want to talk about. But no, and certainly there are other pieces that I've written where I've made some mistakes as well.
Right.
But I've asked the Bucks for their forgiveness, and they have granted it to me as it pertains to me not reaching out for them for comment on that story. And so I'm trying my best to put that behind me. And people can say what they want, and some people may not like the source as it relates to these new developments at Southwestern Seminary. You don't have to like the source because the source has no bearing on a proposition's truth value. I took enough philosophy classes at Southwestern to learn that. So.
Well, and one of the things that one of the ways that these power structures remain in power and continue to attack people like this is that they often put the focus on blaming someone who, like yourself, someone who's young, someone who has had a lot of struggles in life. You're human, you make mistakes. And so they want to make so much discussion about this essay that was written by the Bucks. The discussion about Karen Swallow Prior's responsibility makes more sense. Karen Swallow Prior was the one who received the essay. She was the one who had the implicit responsibility to protect it. But no one thought that she was going to lose her job or suffer any kind of serious setback because of controversy over that essay. So putting all of the effort, the focus on you, in my mind, just creates a smokescreen again, so that we can't get at this deeper problem, particularly at Southwestern, because that's one institution where I continue to be amazed that the Greenway administration keeps on escaping scrutiny and escaping criticism. And they just keep on skating by because, what you brought forward is a pretty big deal. We're in the middle of this debate about sex abuse. He was the one who was supposed to clean up the sex abuse issue. And now he fired the guy who wrote the resolution on non-disclosure agreements. And then his administration is threatening the other sex abuse survivor who's trying to talk about a third sex abuse survivor who, was in the thing. Now, some of it, I think that same-sex abuse that has more of a challenge, more of an uphill climb to get talked about because of all of the loaded politics. I know that on the one hand, you have the liberal pro-gay Christians who will say that somebody in my situation, that I'm not an abuse survivor, I'm just a closeted homosexual who won't agree with me. So they're going to give the abusers the right to define me. And then a lot of people on the conservative side will say he's a former homosexual, which kind of endorses the idea that that's who I was and now I need to repent of my sin and overcome it. They both kind of miss the fact that the proper home for this scenario is in the discussion of sex abuse. And
And Bobby,
this,
I
yeah,
think you're absolutely right. And I do want to make a couple of things clear if I could just interject very briefly, a couple of things. So firstly, very soon actually after my Tom Buck article was released, there were some online accusations that I was guilty of sexual impropriety and had solicited people for sex at Southwestern. I want to go on the record and say that those allegations, those allegations are false.
yeah,
And I'm just, I'm laughing just because I think it's ridiculous, but it's also kind of funny for another reason. I just want to say, and look, I am not affirming. People have accused me of being a progressive. I am not progressive. I am not affirming on the LGBTQ issue. When it comes to
right.
gender relations, I would probably describe myself as a complementarian. So I think theologically, Bobby, you and I would be pretty closely aligned. People have said that I'm like this progressive Episcopalian. I'm not an Episcopalian. I'm an Anglican, and there is a
Right.
difference. At least
Hmm.
here in North America, there is a difference between those two terms.
Right.
But the reason I found the accusation that I was guilty of sexual impropriety so outrageous and laughable was that if I wanted to solicit people for sex, I would not do it at Southwestern Seminary. Just if I'm being honest, if that was something I actually, if that
Yeah,
was
that's
something
not.
I actually wanted to do,
Yeah,
I would
yeah,
have gotten in my
yeah.
car and I would have gotten in my car and just went to TCU because there would have been plenty of people who would want to do a
Okay.
hookup. So
Okay. All right. Okay. Well, I don't know anything about the scene at TCU, so let's I get your message on that, and then let me just try to avoid getting a visual on those ones. Let me ask you about this. Do you think that sex abuse survivors are really helped by this form of discussion where we are focused on these high publicity campaigns against high publicity perpetrators, and the focus is on punishing high publicity people very publicly? Does that help sex abuse survivors? What do you think?
Yeah, Bobby, that's a really difficult question. I think there's a sense in which it does, and then I think there's another sense in which it doesn't. So here's what I
Hmm.
mean. Insofar as any kind of public shaming, public exposure that comes to private abuse, I think it's good that those kinds of things are exposed. And I'm even okay with there being even a little bit of public shaming. Now that makes us very uncomfortable as Americans because there are kind of some cultural
Hmm.
sensibilities that we have, especially among conservatives. We complain about things like cancel culture and things like that. So and listen, I understand those concerns, but insofar as an abuse allegation is not manifestly false and there is a preponderance of evidence that it happened,
Hmm.
and given the fact that the vast majority of sexual abuse cases are not prosecuted, there is a sense in which what you're describing can be helpful. However, it's a two-edged sword, because there is another sense in which that kind of thing is harmful because it puts survivors on the front lines of these kinds of battles, and it will be very, very common for you to see survivors. I have a friend who describes it as kind of bleeding online. The kind of
Yeah.
thing where people
Right.
will have mental health crises, where they will make a need known, and there is this really constant urge and need for support, given that survivors are the ones who are fighting these battles. And I just want to say that I think it is just flagrantly immoral that any survivor should have to fight that kind of battle. This is where men and women and the people of God who serve Christ in his church and claim to minister and
Mhm.
claim to know him need to step in and fill the gap for these survivors. So the answer to your question is kind of a paradox. There is a sense in which the answer is yes, but there's
Mhm.
another sense in which the answer is no.
Mhm. Right. Well, I think I agree with about 80% of what you said. I definitely think that we need to talk about sex abuse as an issue. And we definitely need to bring attention to the people who have systematically interfered with our ability to intervene. That's why sometimes these institutional players, people who are the director of students or the dean of students. I think it's appropriate for some of those people's names to be brought up so we can talk about,
Yeah.
they set up a system, someone like Adam Greenway, who, what a hypocrite. You come in because on the sex abuse issue, and then you have Colby Adams running around shutting people up, who need to have a chance to talk. So I think I agree with that. My big concern, and that's maybe where I don't agree with you, is I just feel as though same-sex abuse survivor, or just sex abuse survivors in general, I think that they need to have access to Christianity. And a lot of Christianity is about redemption. It's about change. It's about forgiveness. It's about not being enslaved by your anger and your rage at someone. And, like finding a way to reconcile yourself with people. And I don't think you can do that when you have this court of public opinion. So one of the things that I don't like is I don't like people using the term credibly accused. I'm like, okay, who's decided what's credible or what's not? We have a court of law. That's one thing. But you can't just say, oh, well, I am an editor or I work for Guidepost Solutions and it looks pretty credible to me. I believe it. So therefore, I'm going to go out and I'm going to say that someone has been credibly accused. Let's get him fired. Let's make him, lose his whole reputation. I just don't think that's healthy for survivors. I mean, first of all, and not to mention the fact that then there are people who are accused. And I think that's unjust.
No, absolutely, and I would just add, a caveat to my remarks from earlier, Bobby. I am agreed with you that there has to be room for forgiveness and restoration. I don't want to mention his name, but there's a very vocal Twitter personality who he claims to be a survivor. And I remember probably about a year ago, he got very, very upset with me when I brought up the concept of forgiveness. Now, granted, this abuse was not. This abuse was not sexual abuse, but I just mentioned to him, I said, well, brother, there comes a point where, constantly attacking this man or woman that you allege is the perpetrator is not helpful. And, that did not sit very well with him. There is also, I think, a sinful tendency among some, Bobby, where people will just not question the actions of survivors or step in and offer counsel or even confront survivors over their sin just because they believe that will make them a bad guy. And I want to state unequivocally here that all of us are sinful victims. None of us are sinless victims. There was only one sinless victim, and that was the Lord Jesus Christ. So I am agreed with you that there has to be room in the process of recovering from abuse of forgiveness, growth in grace, sanctification would be the term that theologians use. I would be agreed with you there. I think our disagreement would probably be over the definition of credibly accused. And one definition that I have found to be helpful, and I want to make it clear, I don't agree with everything in the Guidepost report. The Guidepost report offers the definition of not manifestly false. I don't think that's a helpful definition of credibly accused. The Sexual Abuse Task Force, to their credit, has stated that they find a credible instance of abuse to be an instance where there is a preponderance of evidence that said abuse occurred. And I think that is a better criterion by which to judge the credibility of abuse. But I agree that there can very quickly become kind of a problem of bureaucracy as to who judges what is credible and what is not. So we would both be agreed there.
Yeah, and the term preponderance of evidence is so slippery because sometimes it means 50% plus one. So like literally, if I have 7 pieces of paper and you have 6, no matter what the credibility of those papers are, and then the fact that they're not following the due process of law that's guaranteed to us in the Constitution, that's my thing. Now, you talked about the Guidepost Solutions report. So that was 388 pages long, and it was almost $2 million worth. Do you feel that it falls short?
Oh yeah. Absolutely.
Yeah.
No, sorry. I'm laughing just because, like, I think
Yeah,
it's a valid
it's
question.
a softball question, all right. It's
Yeah.
not like it's not like I'm grilling you here. Yeah,
Oh, no, not
um,
at all.
yeah. No, it did fall short. I what went wrong? I mean, why? I'll give you my theory, and then I'll let you give yours. I think what I perceive as the problem was that it was not really an independent task force. There were too many conflicts of interest, and there were too many people who were involved in the compilation of the report who had people who were tied to other people that they needed to protect. So you had many entity heads, whole entities that were not really investigated at all. They didn't have to waive attorney-client privilege. Everything was focused on the executive committee because of the way that the motion was worded at the convention. But let's get real. That was kind of a manipulative sleight of hand in order to contain the focus. And by containing the focus, it ended up remaining silent on and even protecting some people who I think need to be investigated.
I am agreed with you, Bobby, that I think the report did not go far enough. And in my statement that I released along with
Mhm.
my piece on Monday, I called Southern Baptist to think very, very carefully about considering launching independent probes into every entity, because the 388 pages that we read only touched only touched on the executive committee, as you mentioned, and God
Right.
knows how many pages could be written about the things that have gone on at the
Mhm.
6 seminaries and the 2 mission boards.
Right. I mean, there's so many, but see, here's the thing about it, though, David, where I'm just kind of, I don't. In 2018, they commissioned a study group. Okay, and I could see problems from like 85 miles away when they commissioned a study group because I wanted to lodge some of the things that I had to bring up, and there was no portal. There was nowhere to leave your comments. I remember we tried for so long to find a way to leave a comment. And my friend Tom Littleton, he was looking and looking and looking, and finally he got into touch with some people from the executive committee, and they said, "Oh, we don't have a portal open. You just have to let one of us know." So basically, you had to already have a case that was known. So that's why we kept on hearing about the same cases over and over again. I thought one of the big scandals no one's talking about is that in the report from Guidepost, they had that table, that Microsoft Word table, where they listed the number of complaints that study group received and how they investigated them, and there were only 32. Like yesterday, I probably came across 32 cases in the Southern Baptist Convention. There was a lot more than 32. There were a
Yeah,
lot more people than that trying to
yeah.
lodge, but they intentionally made it so that there was no way to lodge a complaint. And then that just kind of, it dragged it out. They sat on it, and then we get another commission and then another that, then in 2019, the Houston Chronicle report came out. So then that sort of turned into more motions on the floor in 2019. The fall of 2019, there was the Caringwell conference, which ironically was going on as I was being called in and fired at Southwestern. So it's, there were so many ironies there. And then in 2020, of course, it got canceled because of COVID, right? But that was still in the news. And then in 2021, we have Hannah Williams, she's really kind of at center stage. And then we have this a task force, then hiring the Guidepost committee, and then their recommendation is to form another task force. Basically, I just feel like they are dragging this out. And I get the feeling like people who say the investigation is the cover up are it's partway true. It's like by constantly appointing all these commissions, there is time is passing. And so a lot of people's evidence is falling out of the way. I know people at Southwestern who had serious, serious bad experiences there, but now that has faded into it's 4 years ago, it's 3 years ago, and they're tired and they don't want to deal with it. And even if they were going to have an opportunity to bring their complaints to a commission, I don't think that they would. In fact, one of them told me that she would not. She said, "I'm tired. I don't want to deal with this anymore.
Mm,
I'm not going to do it anymore." So, I
yeah,
mean, what?
I can understand that. Goodness.
Yeah, I mean, so what should people? Because here's what I hear people saying: should people just let the Southern Baptist Commission burn to the ground? Should they just let go of it, pull out of the convention, and just, if you want to start a denomination, start from scratch. I mean, what would you tell a Southern Baptist who's out there who is just simply horrified, like paralyzed with disgust over what's going on?
Well, so I can only speak for myself, but I mean, I got out while I could.
Oh, that's right. You are now a member of the Royal Church of England, right? Oh no, you're the Anglican. Well, that's the Anglican Church, right?
That's exactly right. I'm a part of a
Yeah.
parish that is
Right.
part of the Anglican Communion, so that is correct. But on a more serious note, I do not believe, and I know that the word cooperation is very big among Baptists. I do not believe that cooperation for theological education and missionary activity among the churches that make up the Southern Baptist Convention is viable. And it's not
Yeah.
viable for a couple of reasons. Number one, there's some pretty irreconcilable doctrinal differences between the major two camps. Secondly, um, given all of the abuses and misdeeds that have occurred over the past several decades, there comes a certain point to which I think you were forced to ask yourself whether or not you can have a clear conscience before God and be a part of a convention of churches that has, by virtue of its sole membership, by the way, and this is something a lot of people are not talking about, the problem of sole membership, and how now, in view of this report, which I supported, by the way, I think all the information needs to get out there. I just wish that the scope of the investigation had been larger than the executive committee. But given the findings of the report, the Southern Baptist Convention, by virtue of being the sole member of all of these entities that have mistreated survivors, the Southern Baptist Convention now faces what's called descending legal liability. That was partly why the executive committee for years kept a secret database of abusers. And I believe it was Chuck Kelly who wrote a passionate essay on the issue of sole membership, and so that he did not think it was biblical and fit with Baptist polity. And that was probably one of the only things I could say that I agreed with Chuck Kelly on at the time. That
Mhm.
sole membership was a bad idea when it was adopted by the convention 15 or so years ago. So no, I do not think cooperation is sustainable. And really kind of the larger trend happening here in the United States is that denominations are dying. And it seems to be that networks, missional societies, kind of looser affiliations of churches are going to be the future going
Right,
forward.
right. I do agree with you though, that I still think we need to investigate everybody.
Mm,
You
absolutely.
see, that's where, what Guidepost started to do in theory was a good idea, investigate things. But if you're going to ask for attorney-client privilege to be waived, then that needs to be across the board. Adam
Mm,
Greenway has to be forced to open up the books. Al Mohler and Russell Moore, we need to be able to see their emails. You know what I mean? If everyone's got to be able to do the same thing, because otherwise, if you're only shedding half a light onto the darkness, everything that is nasty and evil is going to scurry out of the light into the darkness, and that's what we've gotten. The evil hides out in all of the nooks and crannies where evil people know the light's not going to come. And you know where the light's not going to go because you know who are the people who are compromised with conflicts of interest, and they're protecting certain people. They're married to someone who's working in this field, or they're beholden, or there's a favor, or this person has dirt on them. So I do think at some point they have to go back, because this is a huge crime scene. The convention is a massive crime scene, and I say that
absolutely.
having lived through it. I have written about it. I don't want to beat a dead horse, but the truth is, I suffered so much. My family suffered so much for really having done nothing wrong.
Mm,
And I'm not the only
mm,
one. I'm just at Southwestern, all of those people who were fired and who signed those NDAs,
mm,
people who they had wives who didn't work because we were encouraged to have complementarian households. They had children who had disabilities because they were encouraged to adopt like good Christians. And so some of them had a lot of kids, and then there were a lot of medical bills. And when they were fired, they had to sign those non-disclosure agreements, or else people were going to be going hungry and they weren't going to be able to treat their children's medical conditions. I mean, that's terrible. The
Mm,
scars that that gave to people. I mean,
mm,
I was preaching at Spanish speaking churches all over Texas, and then to get the call from the person at the Southern Baptist Convention of Texas who was involved with Hispanic churches, who said the people at Southwestern say, I can't send you anywhere. I can't even be seen talking to you because that's
mm,
going to put my job at risk, and these revitalization projects that would all be put at risk. You think about the tremendous damage that these people have done with all of their machinery, all of their manipulation. I
mm.
think that it has to be studied. I did a deep dive on the Southern Baptist Convention. I went into JSTOR because my alumni association gives me access to JSTOR. I read about 70 texts that were written about the Southern Baptist Convention in the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s. And these are overwhelmingly from people who are moderate or liberal.
Mm.
And I don't agree with a lot of what they said, but it was eye-opening to see how much they recorded, how much they preserved in terms of the history of people who had suffered so personally because of the mismanagement of a denomination that bore the name of Jesus Christ. And I think that has to happen. It has to be done. I just don't know who could even begin to start it, because okay, let's say the next one coming up is the election between Bart Barber and Tom Askell. Bart Barber was a trustee at Southwestern when
Yes, he was.
all of the stuff that Patterson was criticized for, Bart Barber was there and he was part of that. Then
Yep.
he was part of getting rid of Patterson. He was there when all of the Greenway stuff, and when Randy Stinson came in, who then later on
Yep.
resigns because he has a many years drug addiction, which means that they had to have known something was wrong when they brought him on. I mean, that was all Bart Barber. Bart Barber, so there's no way that that is going to be a healthy development for him to become the president. Tom Askell, he's close with the Conservative Baptist Network, and so I'm not sure whether we want to run to an old boys network because the new boys network is bad. I don't know. I just don't think. I don't know who can start the process of trying to clean up everything that's there, but it's a lot of money. It's a lot of people's lives. You're talking about a huge toxic site. What say you? What should people do in this? You're not going to go to the convention because you're going to get ready to go to the Jubilee with Queen Elizabeth. But what should they do in this election coming up? Should they vote for that dark horse candidate, the number 3 guy who, I don't know, what should they do?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so and I said this on Twitter actually just a couple of weeks ago, just to illustrate how unsustainable I think the Southern Baptist Convention is. The dark horse candidate that you're talking about, Robin Hadaway, I believe his name is, former interim president at Midwestern in Kansas City, and a former missionary, as a matter of fact. The interesting thing about him is that he tweeted just a couple of weeks ago that the abuse number is only made up, 0.00001% of the Southern Baptist Convention, and basically said, look at the numbers. It's not really that big of a problem. And I don't even know. I don't even know if the guy knows where he is right now. And then you have Bart Barber, who was a Paige Patterson enabler for years, and as you mentioned,
Yes.
was part of the group that brought Adam Greenway in, and
Right. Yeah.
all of Adam Greenway's misdeeds. Well, not all
Yeah.
of them. Some of
Yeah.
Adam Greenway's misdeeds that have been recorded in my article,
Yeah.
which I would encourage our
Yeah.
viewers to read. And then we have Tom Askell, who actually said just a couple of weeks ago that he had legal counsel tell him that waiving attorney-client privilege was not wise, and that was his position. So, I said voting for the first candidate, Robin Hadaway, is out of the question. Voting for the second candidate, Bart Barber, is just unwise. And then, in my opinion, voting for the third candidate, Tom Askell, is just immoral. So there is no good option. Probably the best option, if you are a church in the Southern Baptist Convention,
Mm-hmm.
is to no longer be tied down to this tentacular institution that corrupts just about everything that it touches.
Well, okay, so there's a part of me that says, maybe Tom Askell might have a shot for the simple reason that we were talking about this offline. So I don't want to be talking out of school too much. But the
Sure.
thing about my time working under Paige Patterson was I noted that whatever people's issues had with him, he had a tremendous heart for individuals. I remember there being students who came from very troubled backgrounds, and Paige Patterson went to such lengths to get them sponsors and funding. There were so many people
Oh
who were
yeah.
studying
Paige
under.
was part of the reason why I went to Southwestern. I don't know if I ever told you
Yeah,
that, Bobby, but yeah,
yeah,
Paige was part of
and
the reason I
so
went.
and that Greenway has none of that spirit in him. So part of me says the old boys network, as much as it is an old boys network, maybe there's some kind of Anglo-Saxon Protestant grace attached to it, like some old world. So I could see possibly then Tom Askell, but then I say to myself, but Tom Askell, if he were to get into office with these lawsuits coming down the pike and everything, I mean, how would he'd be juggling these things in the air? Maybe the ideal person to vote for is Bart Barber, because if anyone deserves to have to deal with the blow up from all that corruption, it's the guy who had his hands in every corrupt pot. So let Bart Barber just sit on this flaming throne. I don't know. But you're
Well,
right. I think,
and at the end of the day, really, you mentioned the Queen of
yeah,
England, and God, God save the Queen. You mentioned the Queen of
yeah.
England. What's interesting is that the Queen, as you well know, is more of a figurehead than anything else, and that really is what the Southern Baptist Convention president is as well. He doesn't possess any real authority. Really,
Mhm.
the blessing of being elected to the office is putting it on your resume, having it, in your Twitter bio
Yeah.
or whatever, and then you get to speak to the media. And whenever you speak to the media, you in a certain sense, every no one speaks for the convention, but there is a sense in which the Southern Baptist Convention president represents more broadly kind of the interests of Southern Baptists to the outside world. So it really isn't a position that carries with it much institutional authority or power. And I would just
Mhm.
say that whoever wins, I will be very shocked if there is still a Southern Baptist Convention by the time that I am married and have kids.
Well, you know what? That might be a good thing. So maybe that is a positive prophecy on which to end this show. I want to thank you very much for joining it. I want to stay in
Thank you for
touch.
having me.
We've
Absolutely.
both been down a very rocky road, and I think that there are a lot of people out there who bear the burdens that we have borne, and I'm hoping and praying that things will change,
Yes.
and I'm praying that people will never have to be put through what we were put through. I
Mhm.
just don't want ever to think that there's going to be another young man called into an office having to deal with a Colby Adams and an Adam Greenway threatening you with these vague things and
Mhm.
torturing your life, and then going out of the office and having websites speculate about this or that. And I mean, I want there to be something of what Jesus Christ talked about to come,
Yes.
in this. And I think that we can get there.
Yeah.
I really do. So just stay in touch. And when we get offline, I am going to ask that you conjugate at least one of the irregular IRE verbs. I don't know, one of the, like Venio. Do you remember how Venio,
Man,
when
Bobby,
is,
I have lost all of my Latin. I do have Wheelock actually right here on my
we,
bookshelf though, so
okay,
it's
all
a
right.
good
Well,
time to break them out.
we'll go over that. We'll go over that. All right, but thank you very much, and we'll be in touch. Where can people find find the work they're doing? I know that you're taking a hiatus from writing, which I think is healthy, and I want to
Yeah.
applaud you on that. But where can people find work that you have up until now?
Yeah, absolutely. So the majority of my work can be found actually just by searching my name on Google, David Bumgardner, author. And the majority of my writing has been done for Baptist News Global up until this point. And the link to my article, as I understand it, has been shared in the description. But if for some reason someone is not able to find it, if you just Google Adam Greenway, SWBTS abuse, my article will be the first thing that that pops up. And you can also click on my byline and see some of the other things that I've written in recent days.
Okay, well, thank you very much. And to those who are going to watch this, thank you so much for viewing it. And I hope that this has been an interesting discussion. It's probably an unpredictable discussion for people who know the SBC. But yes, David Baumgartner and Bobby Lopez are actually friends, believe it or not.
Yes.
So I want to thank you for watching. And the one thing I would say is get to the bottom of this. All right. Go, don't let the Adam Greenways of the world just sit there perpetually. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Don't come to us in 10 years and being like, he's still in office, and now there's 4 people enrolled in the whole seminary and they've used all the money. What happened? Get to the bottom of it now. Do something. All right.
I'll try my best.
Yeah. Thank you very much. All right.
Thank
Thanks.
you, Bobby. Have a great night.